We are ultimately this morning going to be on Esther chapter 4, so you can get open to that. But we're also blessed this morning, before we do that, to have a visitor with us. So some of you, many of you are going to may not recognize the name Inspiritus. But Inspiritus is the organization in Georgia, now encompasses Tennessee and parts of Alabama too. But that used to be Lutheran Services of Georgia. Okay, we're blessed to have the president and CEO, the fearless leader of Inspiritus with us this morning. And so I thought before we get started with Esther, I'd give him about 5 minutes just to update you on what Inspiritus is doing these days, what's going on, and then as many minutes as you all want to pepper him with questions. Sorry.
Okay.
All right.
That's good. That's great.
And then if there's time, we'll do Esther.
Thanks, Pastor Jeff. I'm John Moeller. I'm the president and CEO of Inspiritus. Joe and I he was like, what's Inspiritus? And as Pastor Jeff said, it is the successor organization of Lutheran Services of Georgia. And when we merged with Lutheran Services in Tennessee, that was no matter what the name was, it was going to be a mouthful. And so we changed it to Inspiritus, which means, it's a real word, Latin, means to fill with the Spirit. And today, as you just heard, our operations, we have offices in Savannah, Atlanta, Birmingham, Nashville, and then our disaster work has just grown tremendously. And so we're in Fort Myers. After the storm, we were there the day it struck. Actually, we were pre-deployed in South Georgia, and we've been on the ground in Fort Myers ever since. Right now, we have about 100 volunteers at a church there in Fort Myers who are serving every day. And we've had volunteer groups, church groups, mission groups with us ever since. We're going to be there all year, rebuilding homes in the Fort Myers community. In addition to being in Fort Myers, Florida, we also have a huge operation in Mayfield, Kentucky. Back in December of 2021, the Mayfield tornado struck. 80 people were killed on that fateful night, and we were there doing debris removal in the days and hours after the storm struck. 14 months later, our team is still in Mayfield, and we are still receiving mission teams and groups to serve and rebuild homes in Mayfield. There was flooding in West Tennessee, in Waverly, you may recall, in the summer of 2021. And there was a train trestle. Water came up against the train trestle. It washed the train trestle off of its mooring, and the train trestle, it was like a dam break. And so literally a wall of water washed through this western Tennessee community, killing dozens and dozens of people. We have been on the ground there now for going on 2 years, still rebuilding that community and receiving mission teams and volunteer groups. So you probably know Inspiritus and our work because of the refugee piece. And we're still working with refugees from around the globe who have been displaced. And we're grateful to do that work right here in Atlanta. But that work is also going on all across the Southeast. We are settling Afghan families, Ukrainian families as well. And the hair-raising stories of families that we get to interact with are just mind-blowing. Our mission, our stated mission, is to guide these families on a path from surviving to thriving. And so it's not just enough to kind of welcome them and say good luck. We want to walk with families until they're really up and running and doing great. And that means everything from getting children enrolled in school, to tutoring after school, to helping mom and dad find appropriate work settings for them, helping them parents get enrolled in school, so that ultimately they can be self-sufficient. And about 96% of the folks that we work with are paying their own bills within 6 months. It's pretty impressive. We also have a foster care program for medically fragile children here in Georgia. And so think about this. We have children on feeding tubes, G-tubes, living with families who are caring for their medical, emotional, and spiritual needs all across Georgia. We also do that for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so adults who need medical treatment receive it in a home of a family, of a member of the community who treats them like they're one of their own and treats them like they're part of their own family. So it's a real joy to get to do what I do and to get to see God at work in the world, in the lives of His children. And we welcome you to join us at the Hunger Walk on the 12th of March, of course. Send a team to one of our disaster sites, adopt a refugee family, become a foster parent, or become a host home. So all kinds of ways to join at where God's at work in the world. And I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions.
So Inspiritus is an RSO, recognized service organization of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So they be we, in a way. And John and I have had talks. We recognize some of the challenges of that because it's not a only LCMS Lutheran entity, right? But doing great stuff, so we'll open up for questions. Just by the way, and I don't even know if he knows this, but you all, pretty much most of you know somebody who's now, I believe, on staff. Melinda McKendrick works somehow with you all now.
So we've hired about 75 people in the last 6 months. So I don't know Melinda.
Okay.
But
she used to be with World Relief or something anyway,
okay.
And so she's one of the many new folks.
Awesome.
But I think she works kind of on the periphery because she does the resettlement. She's resettlement oriented.
Do you have any questions?
Comments?
Well, so if yes, I'm interested in doing one of these things. Where do I look to find out more information? Is there a website?
There is a website. Thank you for prompting me. I'm supposed to always tout that. My staff would slap my hand for failing to do that. You can follow us on We Are in Spiritus, the @ We Are in Spiritus on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I mean, we have all those places. If you happen to be on any of those, at We Are in Spiritus, you'll find us, okay? Choose to follow, and then we'll show up in your feed. But the website is a tremendous resource, and the website is weinspirit.org. Weinspirit.org. But if you were to just type in Inspiritus in your search, it would take you to the
You have to
website.
spell it right.
Other questions?
We do have LCMS members from our circuit on the board.
Yes,
I know,
you do.
Pastor Ray Borchelt's on there still, and it's Vic.
Victor Belton.
Pastor
Many of you know Victor Belton. We just had a board meeting on Friday, in fact, and Ray and Victor were there at the board meeting along with lay people. Ann Detmering is an attorney in Cobb County. She's on our board as well. So we, the history is that the two church bodies, LCMS and Missouri and ELCA, came together and founded us back 40 plus years ago, and still have a role to play, both church bodies in the operation.
So in one of those disaster areas like Tennessee, Florida, what would a typical day be like for that volunteer, and then how long are they there? Like as long as they want to be, or?
Right. So the disaster work that we do in the early days after a storm is going to be very physical. We're oftentimes going to be, after a tornado, sifting and sorting through debris to find the precious things of people, right? Their family photographs, something precious that's gone missing. Then we're going to haul it all to the street. We're going to tarp the roof if holes have been punched in the roof, and in the likelihood of a flood or a hurricane, we're going to be we're basically going to be mucking and gutting the house. So taking all the sheetrock out, all the insulation out, everything's got to go. In Florida, that meant going up 8 feet in each home. In some cases, we actually had to take the ceilings out, and then mold remediation. So we put the young people in that work. They put the hazmat suits on, the masks, and the respirators. And then we're doing mold work. And it's hard work. I don't want to make it seem insignificant, but we have every generation of people on these job sites. The day starts pretty early, honestly. I'm always surprised that we put volunteers. They're sleeping with us at the church. But the day starts early. I want to say breakfast is kind of out on the table at 6:45, 7 o'clock. By about 8 o'clock, everyone's grabbing their tools. We have the most amazing tool trailers. So tools are being loaded into trucks and vans. Everybody's taking off for the job site by 8 or 8:30. And then they're going to be on the job site till 4:30. They're going to have packed a lunch that day at the kitchen. And made their own lunch and going to eat it on the job site. And then about 4:30, we are going to break and come back, and everyone's going to head to the shower trailers or to the showers inside the church. And then there'll be communal dinner again in a fellowship hall setting like this. And then there'll be a team meeting. I mean, we're going to wear you out. But about 7:30, there'll be a team meeting. It doesn't last long. It's an opportunity for everybody to talk a little bit about what they saw, what they experienced, how God was at work, what wasn't working so well, so that maybe we can fix that for the next day. And then about 8 o'clock, everyone's going to have to crash and get their own rest in their own way. Now, you might be saying to yourself, that sounds too physical for me. We got all kinds of other volunteer opportunities on site. So maybe you'd love to work in the kitchen. Think about it. There's a lot going on when we're trying to serve up to 100 volunteers at a time. And so we've got groups that are heading to Costco to do the shopping. We have other groups who are preparing, other groups that are cleaning, other groups that are praying for these volunteers. So it's quite an operation. I mean, we're a self-sufficient city. And there are opportunities for everybody to find a way to contribute. Yes, ma'am?
How do you determine which homes to do?
That is...
the entire neighborhood?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Her question was, how do we know which houses, which families to help? So very early when we arrive, we're going to look for low-income communities. And you might be saying, Fort Myers, are there low-income families in Fort Myers? Why, yes, there are. Yes, there are. And so we're going to quickly go to those communities. We'll help anyone in the early days. Anyone. But if we're going to repair your home, if we're going to rebuild your home, it needs to be your home. Okay? We don't enrich the lives of landlords. And it's really kind of sad because people who rent a house need that home to get repaired as well. That's just not what we do. We only work with homeowners. And what we're going to do is a pretty deep assessment of their financial situation. And we'll work with their insurance. We'll work with FEMA. But so many people are so underinsured in these, especially older adults. In fact, we work with some older adults who had a lapse in their insurance because they couldn't afford to pay the insurance and the medical bills and the pharmacy bills and everything else, and they had to make a decision. and unfortunately they don't have the homeowners anymore. So in some cases we have, with philanthropic dollars, we've paid for the entire home to be rebuilt. But it's always great when we can put Lutheran dollars with some good United Methodist dollars and with FEMA dollars and with some insurance money and put it all together, and our money then goes further, right? We can help more people.
Anything else?
Was this helpful?
Yes.
Good. Have me back. I would love to come back and talk about, with other groups, women's groups, men's groups, about the work of Inspiritus and how, if you're interested, you can get more involved. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And if all that sounded vaguely familiar, some of us are LERT trained, which is Lutheran Emergency Response Team training. And so that would be kind of the more internal, if you will. And it's got a different focus. Lots of times when we go into an area, a lot of times the focus of our Lutheran response folks ends up first focusing on the congregations and the congregation's property and the pastor's property in the area, other church workers' property in that area. Not that the lay folks don't matter, but talk about people who are largely underinsured, and including churches. There's 3 LCMS churches in Fort Myers. 2 of them are in the parts of Fort Myers that we would expect Fort Myers to be like. One of them is not. And it is very much in that, if you will, lower income area that is part of Fort Myers, and they're grossly underinsured. And their insurance company, where the insurance companies, the other 2 congregations are like, sure, right, what do you need kind of thing. The insurance company for this congregation is basically saying you're on your own. So in a lot of ways. And so there's been a lot of focus on them. Okay? So those kinds of things are out there. They're real. It happens everywhere. It's just like people are astounded to find out that there's homeless people in Roswell. There's homeless people everywhere. Roswell's doing the best they can to get rid of the low-income housing and kick the homeless people out. So is Sandy Springs, so is Dunwoody. It's just kind of what's happening up here, unfortunately. But at the same time, what a blessing to be able to be part of these kinds of organizations. So. All right, let's open to Esther chapter 4. I know you're already open to it, I'm not. And let's get what we can done today of Esther chapter 4. If we don't get done, we'll finish next week. This was well worth it. Thank you, John. And let's pray. Lord God, Heavenly Father, first of all, we pray for all those in Tennessee and in Florida that are still so impacted by the storms, the very real storms of this life. We praise you and thank you for groups, organizations like Inspiritus and the LERT groups from our own district and our own district support, that together as your people, we can be part of reaching out in love to help restore people's lives. Bless us today as we study your word. May our time studying Esther continue to lift us up and strengthen us in our lives, walked with you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so at the top of your pages it says, for such a time as this. In a very real way, now we get to the heart of the story. We'll still have some, we still have to have some imagination, right? Because again, in Esther, God's name is never mentioned. We get some hints at him in this chapter, finally, but I'll tell you that you can find all kinds of people who argue about that too, okay? But God's place in the lives of Esther and Mordecai seems to be even more evident. But also, the point is getting clearer for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and read Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, and one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. As for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai that what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 30 days, night or day. 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Okay? Thoughts, questions, comments? My coffee. Anything? All right, we'll jump into my stuff.
I think it shows Mordecai has faith even Esther.
We'll talk about that. There's definitely things in here that can be interpreted as signs of faith in both Mordecai and Esther. But we'll get there. Okay? I love to... anyway, we'll get there. All right. The news is not good. And Mordecai's displeasure is very, very evident. Why might he be mourning so publicly? Sorry.
He saved the life of the king.
Okay, that's probably the one that comes up the most, right, in my reading, is he saved the life of the king. So he's hoping the king will notice that this guy, who, by the way, sackcloth and ashes is not a solely Jewish thing. Okay? It was a sign of mourning in that part of the world, period. So he's maybe hoping that the king notices him. He's not allowed to go into the court of the king in sackcloth and ashes, but he's hoping word will get to the king. Hey, Mordecai's out there in sackcloth, wearing ashes on his face. Didn't he do something nice for you a long time ago? Maybe you should take notice. So that's one. Jody, you were going to say?
Well, the whole idea of mourning for his people ahead of time.
Okay, so Mordecai, remember Mordecai, we know that Mordecai is trying to keep Esther's heritage in wraps. As far as we know, he would be doing the same thing for himself. There was an account that I read, there was a accountant, one of the financial guys of the king of Persia, Xerxes at the time, whose name was Marduk, and they think that very possibly that was Mordecai. Because remember, Esther is not her Hebrew name, right? And he probably went by a non-Hebrew name also, okay? But now he recognizes that the Jews are facing genocide, and he's already told folks that he's a Jew, right? So yeah, he's got skin in the game, for lack of a better way to put it. Okay, good. Why else is he being so public? The obvious one. So that Esther knows what's going on, right? Esther probably doesn't have a clue what the king's up to. She lives in the palace. She's isolated from the rest of the world. As far as we know, the king doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. Right? So, right? He may be trying to simply get her attention. And it works. Right? The folks see Mordecai. The folks know who Mordecai is to Esther. They go into Esther and say, hey, your cousin, Dad, I know that's weird, but it's right. Mordecai is out there in sackcloth and ashes. And what does she do, by the way? Here! What's with you, dude? Get dressed. Right? So, yeah, he's being very, very public. And again, we really don't know why, except to assume it's to get attention. Because he could be doing this. Now, what else happens, are we told, across the provinces? All the other Jews basically join him. So this is now a common thing. Now, we're not going to start placing, and say that there were no faithful Jews in the world, and so, all the sackcloth and ashes were nothing. But again, in this case, we don't know for sure, but we get a little bit of a hint with the sackcloth and ashes, right? But he seems to be mourning the loss of the Jewish people, right? Now, again, we got to be real careful with all this, because we know the Jewish commentators, they stuck Esther in the Old Testament canon for a reason. Why? Because they very clearly saw God organizing all this, right? And ultimately, that we have the celebration of Purim in order to remember it even. So remembering God's providence. They always saw, and we're seeing through this, God's providence, but we don't know exactly where Mordecai and Esther are. But we're getting a little bit of a hint, and I'll explain more in a few minutes. So is Esther really so full of herself that she thinks she will be saved? When she reads the proclamation, right? What does she say? Not my problem. I can't go into the king. What is she thinking? Likely. I know we're doing a lot of assuming, but...
If she goes into the king, he'll kill her.
Yeah, but what is she assuming about this proclamation? I'm the queen. This means everybody but me, which draws a huge correlation to people in the world today, right?
Yep.
Even us, right? Yeah, this means everybody but me. And what does Mordecai come back and say? Don't think you're going to get out of this just because. And she kind of belies the truth of that in her response. I haven't been in the presence of the king for 30 days. This is not what you would call a very close, loving relationship. Right? And so I haven't even been in the presence of the king for 30 days. Well, yeah, that's the point. Right? He's made a decree. Under the laws of the Persians and the Medes, once the king makes a decree, it cannot be turned back, even by the king. It's done. Which will become real important in a couple chapters. But anyway, we'll get there. Okay? Right? So she thinks she's going to kind of get, well, it doesn't mean me. Which, think about it. What does that tell you about Esther? Well, sorry you're all going to die. But doesn't mean me, so I'm not getting involved. Right? Who's she looking out for? Herself. Okay? Herself. At least Mordecai, whether we put the faith thing in or not, right? At least Mordecai seems to be concerned about more than just himself. At least with his words, he says, the Jewish people as a whole are getting ready to get destroyed. Right? But Mordecai comes back and says, don't think you're getting off the hook. Okay? And she concedes to do something. Okay?
Well, when he says, fine, that's fine. God will find it.
He does, yeah. So again,
either you or somebody else.
right. So look at question 3, because this is where we can unpack some of these things, maybe make some assumptions, but I'll give you the other answer here in a minute. Again, God is never mentioned, but we do get some hints that are more hints than are usually present in the book about God and about Mordecai and Esther and possibly their understanding of God working in this. It says, what are some of these? Okay, so one of them is what Jody just brought up, right? Look at Mordecai's second response to Esther. Okay, verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any others. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Okay? To our ears, what does that sound like? God's going to fix this somehow, whether you're involved or not. Yeah.
They believed in the covenant promise, so they believed that the Savior is still yet to come.
Well, the Jews did. The Jews did.
Yes.
But again, Mordecai doesn't bring that up.
Well,
He just says something else will happen. Right? Again, God's never mentioned. We hear it and we hear, well, of course Mordecai has faith. Doesn't say that here.
But Pastor,
Yeah.
when the Jews, we know that Jesus always went to a synagogue to teach first.
Right. Right.
Synagogues were established in these communities
Mhm.
even when they were in captivity.
Mm-hmm.
I want to think that there was that knowledge from their text and their scripture, the rabbis.
Yeah, and you'd think there'd be some knowledge that telling your daughter to go prostitute herself to the king and become queen wouldn't fit into going to synagogue, right? So we're not seeing actions and words at all match. And that's just what I would tell you, is that the Old Testament rabbis, they definitely took this as, see, Mordecai was, this unbelievable man of faith. And then other Jewish rabbis say, nope. Right? And then amongst Christian commentators going through the book of Esther, I'll tell you again, it's probably 50-50. Right? This commentary that I've been using as primary, the People's Commentary, it went out of its way for the first 3 chapters to say there is nothing here to suggest to us that Esther or Mordecai were anything more than Jews by blood.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden in this chapter completely flops and says, see? And I went, dude, don't do that to me, right? We don't know still. Every single thing that we read in the book of Esther, from Esther and Mordecai, can be explained in a different way. Okay? Now, sackcloth and ashes were a very common way to show your mourning before your God, regardless of who your God was. Saying somebody else, somehow this is going to get worked out, might not be referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, these folks are surrounded by the gods of the Persian Empire now. Historically, nearly 100% of the time. I want to say 100%, but I'll put nearly in there just to couch myself a little bit. When God's people found themselves surrounded by the gods of the area, what did they do? They worshipped them. Okay? If those of you who are reading along, are going to be reading along Limping with God by Chad Bird during Lent, we're going to get to a point where Jacob has to go back and see his brother Esau. And so he splits all the stuff up, right? Puts his 4 wives in different places and all that kind of stuff to protect it. And one of the things that they have to do before they go back into the promised land and see Esau is they have to get rid of all of the foreign gods that they brought with them. So for us to think, or for us to assume that every Jew who was living in the Persian Empire in all of these different places, 127 provinces, were faithful to the one true God is an assumption that we probably cannot make. Were there faithful Jews? Sure, we can name 4 of them. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right? Again, we know that Esther seems to be written in a more historical manner of the writings of history of that time and in that society. But there are ways to answer all of this, right? I even saw commentators who say, right, some commentators who say, well, obviously Esther is faithful because she asks everybody to fast with her. And fasting included prayer. Sure it does. Every fast ever done to any god on the face of the earth, God with a small g, includes prayer to that God. One even I read suggested that Esther fasted herself so that she'd lose some weight and look better to the king. Now, that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but we're not told any reasons why ever. Just that they did. We're not told that Mordecai, remembering the promise that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, said, God will take care of this somehow, whether you're involved or not. No, he didn't say that. Right?
But he always had.
I know, Barb, you're really wrestling with it.
No, I'm just thinking about, so she could lose weight. And I'm thinking, people in those days didn't have the weight because most of them were impoverished and the fat.
Yeah, but she's the queen.
Yeah.
She got to eat. And yes, I read that and went, oh, come on. And at the same time, I don't think the commentator was suggesting that that's actually... But remember, right, one of the things we have to be careful not to do is just discount things because we know what they were thinking, right? I'll tell you, since we kind of mentioned those things, right, some of the things that look like, and maybe they are, I'm not, right? I'll tell you that it seems even more of a strong argument for the providence of God if Mordecai and Esther don't really believe. Or are only going through the motions, right? Or are part of the no atheist in a foxhole kind of thing, right? It's gotten bad, so we better go pray to God. I remember Mom telling me about that one day, kind of thing. Yeah.
But if you go through all of the Old Testament, and which I'm kind of doing,
Yeah.
God always raises a remnant.
God always raises a remnant, but he also uses a whole lot of people who don't believe in him to raise the remnant.
That's Joseph's
Right.
point.
Right. He's going to raise a remnant. We know that, right? But does Mordecai?
Don't know.
I don't know.
Does it matter?
No.
That's why I say, for me, it almost strengthens the whole point of the book for this unknown faith of Mordecai and Esther. Because it does not matter the faith of Mordecai and Esther. What matters is the faithfulness of God.
And that we're reading it.
Yeah.
There's a reason why God wanted us to know this story.
God wanted us to know this story.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be here.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of reasons God wanted us to know this story, right? Well, we can throw a couple of reasons in there. The primary one being, again, if Xerxes or Haman is successful through his decree, he's managed the complete genocide of the Jewish race, which means what? No Jesus.
And in 14, he's saying to them, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a
Time as this, right? And we'll get to that because that's a big one that we have to unpack today. Yeah. So, question. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I've read this many times. It never occurred to me that they weren't believers.
Yeah. It wouldn't occur to us that they're not believers, right? Because what are we used to reading in the Bible?
Right.
How God uses, right? Recognize Mordecai and Esther are not listed in Hebrews 11. just saying, okay? Just saying, okay?
Or in the genealogy.
Or in the genealogy, right? Well, we don't know necessarily that they're in the genealogy of Jesus.
No.
Right? In fact, my guess is they're not. Right? Doesn't matter. Of the 127 provinces filled with Jewish people, the line of Judah and the line through which Jesus will be born is there. Right? Doesn't matter that Mordecai or Esther, whether Mordecai or Esther are part of it. Okay? I think I already answered this before. Let's assume that Mordecai and Esther are acting and speaking as if by faith. Again, we don't know for sure. If they are, great. If they're not, like I said, for me, it actually strengthens the whole focus of the Bible. This is what God is doing. Okay? What very human trait might we be seeing? Well, it's that I don't want to die. It's that no atheist in a foxhole kind of thing, right? When do we see people praying more than ever? Right? When we're facing crisis, right? Either crisis of somebody else that opens up our minds to our immortality, like Damar Hamlin, right? We had everybody in the praying because Damar Hamlin died on the field in an NFL game, right? And people came to me, and I know, you all know me, and if I can find something that's wrong with something, I'm going to find it, right? Isn't it neat, Pastor, that everybody's praying? And I would say, yeah, but to who? Right? I mean, yeah, I said, they showed pictures of the whole Buffalo Bills team on their knees in the middle of the field. Mm-hmm. You cannot tell me that every single person on that team and all the staff are Christians. We don't know who they were praying to. Okay? Now, were there a lot of Christians suddenly praying when they don't usually pray? Yeah, cool. Good stuff, right? After 9/11, yeah, what happened to the attendance in Christian congregations in the United States? Went through the roof. Everybody was rejoicing, right? Not rejoicing at what happened, but look, God's brought us back to our knees. Guess what the reality was 6 months later? Attendance had fallen below where it was before 9/11. One of the very human things that I think we get faced with, even as Christian human beings, and that I kind of see in this story, is that very real feeling of, God, what have you done for me lately? When everything's good, look at how good God's being to me. And when everything gets bad, it's kind of like, God, where'd you go? How come my life ain't wonderful? What have you done for me lately? And so if there's a faith element here, it seems to have been awakened, if you will, by terror, right? Which in itself is a very real human thing, right? We tend to pray more, whether we admit it or not. We tend to pray more when we're in trouble than when we're not, okay? And when we're not in trouble, our prayers are lots of gimme, gimme, gimme prayers, okay? And that sense of, right, where's God when I need him? Okay? But I do want to get to this, and we're actually going to get through 4 today. So that line that Carol brought up, for such a time of this, as this. I said it's a sobering line, and that was part of Mordecai's message to Esther. But it's not just for her, right? Who knows? But that you haven't been placed here, in this place, in your current position, for such a time as this, right? If there's any line in here that might suggest that Mordecai has faith, I think this is it. Okay? How does the phrase pertain to our lives, both individually and as a congregation?
I mean, we ask the same thing for ourselves.
We're being asked the same thing of ourselves. Who knows? But that you haven't been placed here for such a time as this. Regardless of the situation in your life. I don't know how many of you, probably not you sitting here, but folks in the congregation, have finally recognized as they sit in the hospital forever, or they sit in a care facility forever, or in hospice care for a lot longer than they expected to be, and they finally realize that God's doing some amazing things because there's people taking care of them that need to hear about Jesus, right? And little things. The people taking care of them are seeing this guy come and pray and bring communion every once in a while. And all of a sudden they start asking questions. They don't ask me. They ask the person laying there in the bed, right? For such a time as this. So individually, Karen said it's a question we ask of ourselves, and in a way we do, but at the same time it's really more something to remember of ourselves. No matter what's going on, no matter what situation we find ourselves in our lives, we don't know what God might be doing through us and through that in that situation. Okay, how about as a congregation?
I guess the same.
It's the exact same thing, right? Some of you have heard me say more than once, right? We're watching Christianity in the United States take a nosedive, right? You've heard me say it before. Now the numbers are suggesting that less than 50% of the population of the United States even claim to be Christian. And we know part of that includes the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses that we don't consider Christian, right? But whether it's the Lutheran Church, whether it's the Methodist Church, whether it's the Baptist Church, whether it's the non-denoms, especially in the non-denoms right now, the numbers are just falling precipitously. Okay? Now we think we know why. We think prior to COVID there was still a lot of social Christianity going on in the world, or in the United States, so people went because it's what they were brought up to do, and it's what you do, and whatever. All of a sudden we go through 2 years of COVID, and nobody's going to church. And they realize, I don't have to. Right? And so, well, it's not just I can see them on TV. It's I don't have to go to church because I don't really believe this stuff. I was just going. Right? The people who are just watching on TV are counted in that less than 50% Christian. I didn't say less than 50% claim they go to church. I said less than 50% claim to be Christian. Okay? So, we can sit around and say, poor, miserable us. Or we can pat ourselves in the back and say, we pretty much got everybody back who was active here before COVID at this point. We see a lot fewer people in church every Sunday, but that's because a lot of the people who only came once in a while aren't coming at all now. Okay? We can pat ourselves in the back and say we're doing okay. I mean, look, we came out financially sound after another year that looks scary and look at this place and we're doing great, we can pat ourselves on the back. Or we can sit down and we can say, God has placed us, because this congregation is not a building, it's a people, right? God has placed us in this place, at this time, in this community, in the communities we live, which is pretty much all of northern Atlanta suburbs, for such a time as this. We're not here by mistake. I mean, ultimately Mordecai is saying, Esther, you're not in your position by mistake. We are not here by mistake. Now, I'm still really, really upset with the seminary when I left. Because they didn't give me a crystal ball. That I could look into it and know the future so that I could tell you all what we need to be doing because we know what's going to happen in the future. We don't have that crystal ball. Right? We got to do something a little bit tougher. We got to trust that God knows what he's doing. We have to act like we trust that God knows what he's doing. And we have to trust that God's going to, smack us upside the head if we're doing something stupid. Which will happen because I'm leading you. So it's kind of a given. So, yeah.
All I was going to say is he's given us the crystal ball through Scripture, whenever you use it to the glory of God. And so we have to think of our lives very differently because God uses us all of the time wherever we are, period. And so our ministry is not Sunday morning, although you do a very excellent job, I would say.
Well, thank you.
But our ministry is when we leave here, go out and live life.
But let's think about it. You're right, but let's think about it from an Esther point of view, right? When Mordecai says, "Who knows that you haven't been placed here for such a time as this?" What's Esther's response?
She's been asked.
If I die, I die. That's a little bit different than I think sometimes we grab onto the idea we're here for such a time as this. Because we grab onto the as long as it's safe. What if God's got us here for such a time as this that ain't so safe? Ain't so safe for any of us individually. Although I had a conversation with somebody this morning who had a really neat idea for doing something and wanted to put a banner up, and I said, well, we can't, because Sandy Springs only lets us put up three a year, and we have those 3 covered with Easter, Christmas, and VBS. And they basically said, well, what are they going to do to stop us? And I said, well, the problem is Rivercliff gets in trouble, and that means I get in trouble because I'm the senior pastor. And then we create an adversarial relationship with Sandy Springs. And remember, we're under a variance here. This is not, our property is not zoned for a church. It's zoned for residential. And can they just pull our variance because they feel like it?
Yes.
Absolutely. Can't they, Bruce?
We have a special use permit.
But
It came from Fulton County.
it came through Fulton County, and now it's Sandy Springs.
50
So,
years ago.
yeah. So the answer is, if they really wanted to, they could cause us great grief.
They can cause trouble, yes.
Yeah. I knew Bruce had the answer to that, so I was kind of waiting to see if he was going to shake his head no or yes when he said that. Right? So, do we want to create an adversarial relationship with Sandy Springs?
No.
I don't. When I retire, you all can do what you want.
Oh.
But I don't. Okay? So we've got restrictions, we've got limitations, we got to live within them. But maybe there comes a day where we say, pardon my French, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and we don't care what Sandy Springs says. Because we're so committed to something that is absolutely clear God has us to do. So far, we've managed to not do that stuff. And so far, everything we do is pretty safe. Right? Because we live in the United States. we're roughly safe here. But I don't know how long that's going to be true.
Yeah.
Okay? All right. Anything else before we close? I'm preaching today, so I don't have to rush over. Hey, we got through chapter 4 and John. Not John, but John. I appreciate John. John walked in this morning. He and I know each other, and he walked in, and I said, "Well, good morning." And after he got over his surprise that I actually recognized him, he said, "Thanks for having me." And I said, "For what?" Things are starting to happen around here that I don't know about, which is absolutely wonderful. He's here to encourage us to be part of the hunger walk. So we appreciate that. Let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. By the way, for those of you who are A+ personalities and need to figure all this stuff out, I am going to try to figure out how to be done with Esther by Easter, so that Palm Sunday is our last day. But I'm gone one of those Sundays, and we got 6 chapters and 6 weeks left. So, yeah. And I'm going to be gone one of them. So I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but my plan is to be done before Easter. Okay. God's blessings, everybody. We do have to take down the tables. Please.
Table's okay.
No, I just said we have to take them down. Such is the